February 27th in the year of 2007. We are conducting an interview for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. We are at the recording studio of the Central Connecticut State University in New Britain, Connecticut. My name is Michael Marinaro. Our camera and sound man is Wayne Boyle. We will be interviewing my friend and colleague, Henry Singer. Henry is 63 years old and served domestically in the Coast Guard as a lieutenant. He served during the Vietnam era. Good afternoon, Henry. Where did you grow up, Henry?
Grew up in Brooklyn, New York.
And what was your family like?
Well, it was a traditional nuclear family, a working father, stay-at-home mother, an older sister, and a younger brother.
And what is the dimensions of your current family or your recent family?
Well,
How many children do you have?
In fact, my family is almost a carbon copy of my parents' family. That there are 3 children, except instead of two boys and a girl, I have 2 girls and a boy.
Was there any history of military contact in your original family?
My father did not serve as a in the military service per se, although he did work in the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard building fighting ships for the Navy. He worked on several aircraft carriers, including the USS Hornet and the USS Wasp. But his brother, my uncle, actually did see military service overseas in Europe. He was in a combat area, and he was one of the lucky ones from his neighborhood that came back. A lot of young men in his neighborhood that went overseas didn't all return, and they didn't all return in good shape, those that did. He was very fortunate. He came back in one piece.
What was his rank, and where do you recall specifically where he served?
I know it was in a combat area in Europe. Exactly where, I don't know. He was an enlisted man. I know that. I don't believe he had been to college at the time he was drafted. So I know, and I also know from pictures that I saw. I didn't actually see him in uniform, but many pictures I saw afterwards in family photo albums showing him in his uniform, and they were the uniform of an enlisted man, as far as I know.
Where did you go to grammar and high school?
I went to the neighborhood public schools in New York City near where I lived, Public School 67, PS 67, and then from there I went to junior high school, and after that I went to Wingate High School, which I understand is now in the process of being raised. It's building's over 50 years old. So, but that was my undergraduate school through the New York City school system.
Did you earn any honors during your grammar and high school time?
None in high school, but while I was in junior high school, I did win the gold medal for achievement in foreign languages and Spanish.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college right out of high school to Brooklyn College, which was not far from where I lived, Brooklyn College in Brooklyn, New York.
And from there?
From there, after I graduated, I looked for work, which was not easy to find because my draft status was 1A. But I did find work in the accounting department of a motion picture studio headquartered in New York City. And while I was there, I went to evening school at the Baruch School of Business of City College of New York.
And when did you graduate from there?
I didn't graduate. Actually, I was going there as a matriculated student, just getting additional credits until I decided exactly what I wanted to do as far as a graduate degree. And by that time, I knew I was getting very close to having to deal with military service.
And what particular issues at that time had you feeling that you were close to military service?
Well, all young men 18 at the time had to sign up with the selective service system, and they gave you a rating. And some people that were in college got a student deferment. I was already graduated from college, so my rating was 1A, which means I was eligible to be called at any time for military service. And I knew that once I was out of college and I no longer could ask for deferment, I was just working and single, I knew that I was definitely getting close.
What was the world political climate like at that time when you graduated from college and when you were working?
Well, as I said, this is more than 40 years ago, so that's quite a stretch. I don't remember too much, but what I can recall is that it was nothing like the world situation today. Basically, at that time, we were looking at one enemy, the enemy, which at that time was Russia, the Soviet Union. We were concerned about the bomb, and even when we were in grade school, we used to have these take cover drills where we'd hide under the desk, supposedly to help us survive an attack. And that's basically all we were focusing on was our adversary, the communists, versus us. Now, of course, we have a whole different type of enemy, or actually the one enemy is replaced by many enemies, but it was very different then.
How did you feel about President Kennedy's assassination?
Well, I was in college at the time, and I guess like many students at the time, I think we had a special affinity for the Kennedys because they were the youngest people to occupy the White House, as far as we knew, and it was just a great experience to be able to relate to younger people having a say in governing the country. And of course, his being cut down in the prime of his life and his presidency really affected a lot of people, and I was particularly moved by that and very, very saddened by it. It was just a tragedy. I love this country, and of course anything disruptive like that just was a big shock. In fact, I was so moved by it, I went down to Washington, D.C. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember just going down and getting on the bus real early in the morning and getting down there. I don't know, it must have been in the late morning, and I must have waited online for hours in a line of people. It must have been several miles long, just to get a chance to pass by the coffin, which was in the Capitol Rotunda.
When did you first hear of Vietnam?
I don't know if there's any one particular time, but it was obviously something that was in the news from time to time, and I guess the situation there was getting more tense as time went by, and I guess eventually the United States started to get involved in a small way, and then it became a very big way, and it was really escalating at the time. And we read a lot about it, but like most people in this country, you know, the problems are always thousands of miles away, and you don't think about them too much as being that close to home until you actually are faced with the prospect of having to possibly go over there and fight.
Could you share with us the background of why you enlisted and how?
Well, I was actually drafted. I had been waiting to see if maybe this would go away or they would bypass me, but it didn't happen. And one day I just got a draft notice in my hand, and now I was really getting concerned. And I had actually investigated or thought about the idea of going into officer training school because my cousin had already done that. He had graduated from college and decided to go right into the Navy as an officer candidate. I guess he didn't want to wait for the draft to catch up to him, and he was already stationed on board the USS Saratoga in the Mediterranean, and the letters he wrote me sounded like he was having a grand time, you know, going ashore in exotic places and having his own private stateroom and eating in the officer's dining room, all kinds of nice meals, and in general, not a bad life. And so I knew that this was something that might be worth looking into, and when I got the draft notice in hand, I was wondering whether or not it was something I could still do, and I found out that I could, and I went down to the U.S. Coast Guard recruiting station down at Whitehall Street in New York City, and I spoke to them, and they were looking for people as much as the Army was looking for people, and they said, well, you certainly qualify because you have the college degree, and if you want to join in, we'll take care of the draft notice. I said, here it is, I'm ready to go.
Did you have an option then to possibly go into the Navy rather than Coast Guard?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did think of going into the Navy because my cousin was there, and I figured, hey, if it's good enough for him, you know, he's 1 year older than me, so I've kind of always let him lead the way, and if it works, I follow him. If it doesn't, well, I don't make the same mistake. But the Navy at the time was looking basically for pilots for flight training, and my vision was not good enough to pass the Navy flight physical. They offered me the opportunity to go in as what they call a naval observer, which means that I would fly with a pilot, but I would be in the back, but I'd not actually be able to ever assume the role of a pilot. And quite frankly, I don't recall as I'd ever flown at the time. So the whole idea didn't sit too well with me, and I said, thanks, but no thanks. I'll look elsewhere.
Where did you go for your initial training?
I went to the Coast Guard, the Officer Candidate School of the Coast Guard down in Yorktown, Virginia.
What were your thoughts those first days in training?
Well, I loved it because I never did get a chance to go away to college as many of my my friends at high school did. They all went to, not all of them, many of them went to colleges out of town and lived on the dorms and in essence had a taste of what life is like as an adult, being on their own. I did not have that experience. I went straight from high school to a commuter college and lived at home and stayed at home and studied at home. And this was a great opportunity. And when I got down there, it was sort of like the going away to college that I never had an opportunity to do, and I loved it.
What did your training consist of?
Well, it was basically a 3-month program, and as far as I know, it was very similar to what recruits went through at in the enlisted ranks. That is, we had our exercises and had to do all kinds of physical activities to train us, but we also had a lot of classroom instruction. It was, to a large extent, almost like an extension of college. At least from my perspective, it was.
Did you acquire any special skill that you recall?
Well, we all were generalists while we were in there, and we were sort of up to to the Bureau of Personnel when we graduated to determine both where we would go and what we would be doing. I guess I don't know if there was any one particular thing that I learned down there. I guess we all learned how to navigate and how to handle a ship and some of the basics of leadership and things like that. But it was, and we had an opportunity to indicate what we'd like to do and where we'd like to go, but for the most part, I think they were ignored.
Handling the ship, to what extent was that?
Well, we actually had to go out on various sized Coast Guard vessels and go up on the bridge and actually be the one responsible for making navigation decisions. Of course, there was an officer on duty there with us, but we had to actually go out and in some cases actually spend the night on board the vessel and get the experience of what it would be like to actually be a deck watch officer, which is what we were all being trained for.
And did you enjoy that particular phase of the training?
For the most part. There was only one night that we went out on a very small vessel in very, very rough seas. And I think that was the only time I can ever remember getting close to being seasick. I never actually ever got seasick, but this was a particularly tough one. And I was told that many of my colleagues didn't survive that. They had to be put off the ship for that experience. I survived the night, but it wasn't particularly comfortable. But other than that, it was, I liked it.
Were you involved with any weapons during this training?
Yes. During the training, well, we were all given instruction on the various armament that we had on board Coast Guard vessels. And of course, this is not like the Navy, but we did have 50 caliber machine guns. We did have 5-inch, actual guns that could be fired at other vessels. And we did learn all about them, how to aim them, how to fire them, how the projectiles work. We had some training in ordnance. Yep, we did.
Stepping back a minute, did you earn any awards while you were in training?
I'm not aware that they actually did give awards when we graduated. I honestly don't recall that. No.
Were there any women training with you?
No, at that time it was strictly men. No, this is not the Coast Guard of 2007. It was this was the old school. It was only men. There were no facilities for women. There may have been some women on base, but they were not involved with the training.
What were the uniforms like? Did you like them?
Well, the uniforms that we had were very similar, at least while we were in the training phase, at least for the first month or so. were very similar to what the enlisted men had. They were the bell-bottom pants and the sailor hat, which we rolled up and kept in our lockers. But we also had some dress uniforms, and by this time we had completed 8 weeks of training, and those that had survived, we actually started to have some of the officer clothes, the more formal wear, and that's what we began to wear as we got closer to graduation.
The Naval Submarine Service has been sometimes termed the silent service. Would that name been more appropriately applied to the Coast Guard?
Well, the Navy had other names, so they used to call us the Wavy Navy. But as a matter of fact, the training center was very close to the Naval Weapons Station, where they loaded Poseidon missiles at the time onto submarines. They went up the Thames River there, and the submarines would go there. And of course, you never really knew when they were there, when they were not there. It was all very secretive. But no, we were actually quite visible to the public, very visible. It was not just, everybody was not out on shore. A lot of them we worked on small craft in harbors and in those areas. So we were not silent, maybe not the best known or the best funded arm of the service, but definitely not the silent service.
What was the primary world role, as you saw it, of the Coast Guard at that time?
We were basically responsible for maintaining aids to navigation up and down the various coasts, both of East and West Coast. Also, what we did was captain of the port, where we're responsible for keeping track of vessels going in and out of the harbor. We also did a lot of oceanographic work. We did search and rescue operations, ships in distress, fishermen or commercial vessels. And we also did station keeping. There were several ocean stations where we went out there and would transmit weather data and various information on atmospheric conditions that were used by airplanes and other vessels that were transiting the sea lanes.
What were your first assignments, and where were they?
My first assignment was not on board a vessel. I had this idea that I would like to be assigned to a base down in Florida or down in Puerto Rico, and I guess nobody even paid attention there because I got orders to go to Boston, which was not very far from my home, and I was stationed to the base there, and my first assignment was to run all the base activities there related to their non-appropriated funds businesses. In other words, things not by Congress there. They had a post exchange, they had an officer's wardroom, we had a liquor store that was run basically for the convenience of the military, and that was my first assignment.
Where did you go from there?
From there, after about 2 years, there was somebody that was already on board ship that was set to go off ship and succeeded me, and I replaced him on board an oceanographic vessel that was doing oceanographic work out down actually by the coast of South America. So I knew it was going to be a long time away from home.
And your tenure in the Coast Guard was how long?
3 years and 4 months. 4 months from training school, and then 3 years actually as active duty as an officer.
During your service, was the Coast Guard involved in combat anywhere?
Yes, as a matter of fact, this was a little bit of a surprise because I think some of us may have been thinking, I know I was one of them, that we could be safe by being in the Coast Guard because generally they didn't go far from the coast. Wrong. At that time, the way the structure of the Coast Guard is, in times of war, they become part of the Navy, and the Navy can do what they want with them. And inasmuch as we had a lot of experience in small boat operations, this was a perfect fit for operations in Vietnam, where there was a lot of activity on the coastal areas of Vietnam, and a number of our 95-foot patrol craft were sent to Vietnam along with many of my colleagues from training school. I was not one of them.
And did you hear from any of your colleagues who were?
There was one in particular because he was another fellow from Brooklyn, and so I knew him well. And yes, I did speak to him. I don't know exactly the circumstance, but we did make contact at one point in time because I was later transferred back to Staten Island, and after he had completed his tour of duty in Vietnam. He was the post exchange officer in Staten Island, so we got to talk to each other. And he was there in combat, and he said he was lucky to be there because he had distinctly remembered, he was actually commanding officer of one of the vessels, and he was having dinner one night, and a bullet just whizzed inches from his head through the glass there. And he said, I consider myself very lucky to have come back in one piece.
What was your most memorable experience during this period?
Of being in the Coast Guard?
Yes.
Well, I can't pinpoint any one experience. I do think that the time on board ship was definitely more sticks in my memory more because we were away for 66 days on one particular voyage down to Brazil. We picked up an officer from the Brazilian Navy to assist us in doing oceanographic work, and also as a courtesy to Brazil to have one of their own officers on board our vessel because we were technically in their waters. And it was just tremendous being in the southern hemisphere, seeing the southern constellations, and it was like being in another world. I loved it.
What were some of your command duties?
When I was on board the oceanographic vessel, the Coast Guard cutter Evergreen, I was the commissary officer of all things. It was my responsibility to make sure that the enlisted men, food was there, food was accounted for, and also that we had the right stores. Of course, I had a staff working for me, but I was the one ultimately responsible for signing off on the inventory and making sure that we collected enough money to pay for the officers' meals as well. That was basically my duty there.
Did you like being responsible?
For the commissary, no. I didn't like it at all because...
You preferred another position on that?
Well, I definitely did want another position, and but there was another fellow there that was in my particular class that was already what they call the communications officer, which I thought I would probably do better as, but the captain insisted that that was what he wanted me to do, and you were also generally a deck watch officer as well, but that was my basic assignment.
Was that because of your accounting background?
I can only guess that might be what it was, but I guess they were not satisfied with my attitude, so when the ship returned from its patrol, I was put ashore and transferred to another ship down in Staten Island.
By attitude, you expressed this?
Well, yeah, I guess they knew that I didn't like it, and the commanding officer and the executive officer were both academy graduates, and there was a kind of a natural resentment between the 90-day wonders who were officers and those that had gone for 4 years to the Coast Guard Academy, and it was very easy to generate tension, and I guess I didn't really pay enough attention to the politics involved, but just did what I thought was right, and I guess that was, to some extent, a mistake. But that's okay. I had a chance to get closer to home. I went back to Staten Island. My parents still lived in New York, and then I was given the assignment that I wanted. I was the communications officer on board the ship.
And where did that ship go?
This ship went on some rather rough assignments. We did weather patrol in the North Atlantic. It was definitely different, and if this was the commanding officer of the Evergreen, his way of getting back at me, he did a good job because we had some great duty down in Bermuda and down in Trinidad and the Caribbean, and now we're freezing our what's off in the North Atlantic and strong gale winds, and it was definitely different.
What did you do after that assignment?
I was also given a collateral assignment as the cryptographic officer. I kind of opted for that one because I always enjoyed puzzles and things like that. I guess they saw that, and the guy that did it wasn't also required a lot of record keeping. He was ready to go ashore anyway, so they thought they would give it to me. And the other bone that they threw at me is that if I took the job, they would send me for 2 weeks to crypto school at the Naval Cryptography College in Newport, Rhode Island. And I said, sounds good to me. So I did, and they did, and it was two fantastic weeks down there. It was just terrific. And then I went back and resumed my duty on board ship.
Terrific in what respect?
Oh, well, the officers always lived well. I mean, we ate, the group that was there in the crypto school, we ate in the officers' dining facilities. There were, I remember still to this day walking in there, and there were two it almost looked like a wedding. There were two fountains with lions' heads with white wine and red wine coming out and flowing, and just put your cup up under there and helped yourself. The meals were just elegant. The furnishings were elegant. We had our own room. Oh, it was like being on vacation.
How about the learning?
Oh, we learned too. Oh, it was very, very fascinating. I can't discuss any of the details, but just being involved in learning about some of the incredible methods and processes that we have for encoding, transmitting, and deciphering information was just, I was very impressed. It was fascinating.
You were training to be a code breaker.
To some extent, yes.
Did you consider yourself a leader when you served?
Well, not really. I mean, we all had to be, we were all in charge of certain departments, so we were forced to be leaders, but I don't see myself as one that took particularly any initiative to try to do anything more than I was required to do.
And what was your last assignment before you were terminated?
Before I was released. That's the correct designation. My duties as communications officer on board the Coast Guard cutter Campbell out of Staten Island was my last tour of duty. I was so fascinated by what I was doing that I actually gave some thought to staying on. And the engineering officer, whose father happened to be no less than the #1 man at the Bureau of Personnel, he was an admiral, so he definitely knew what he was talking about, came and talked to me one day when I told him I was thinking about staying on, and he advised me not to. And I said, why? He says, well, he said, let me tell you this. He says, you're a good officer, you do a good job, and we respect you on board. Problem is, nobody outside the ship knows who you are. When the day is over and it's time to go ashore, you don't go to the officers club, you don't socialize, you head home, come back in the morning, and nobody knows you. So what's going to happen is that they'll see your reports when they make recommendations for promotion, and they'll all scratch their heads and say, who's this? And if they don't know you, you're not going anywhere. And don't forget, it's like a triangle. As the ladder gets up, there are fewer and fewer that are making it, and those that are making it are those that have a good record and those that are known. So my suggestion is, you're not well known, my suggestion is go back to civilian life. So I did.
Do you regret having made that decision?
No. Because the one thing that you sacrifice, obviously, is where you're going to live and where you're going to be assigned. And at that time, the Coast Guard was very actively involved in setting up the long-range navigation stations called LORAN. And these were stations all over the world, literally all over the world, in some of the most isolated places. And if you were assigned there, you were expected to be there for at least 18 months. And I somehow didn't like the idea of losing control of my life that way. It may have been a good way to advance in the service. We'd also taken possession of 2 of the Navy's old icebreakers, and that was another one of our functions, was icebreaking duties to make sure that certain navigation passages were kept clear, and that didn't appeal to me either, quite frankly. So I did opt to go back to civilian life.
In summary, how was overall the life in the service? Did you feel at ease and secure?
I loved it, which was probably different than most people that I know may have approached. I know when we were in training school, I'd say many, perhaps even most of them, resented having to be there, and they did a lot of stupid things. They just ignored orders, and they tried to do everything they could to get around the system. And of course, the more they tried, the worse it was for them, because it was known that that's what they were trying to do. And I just went with the flow. I knew that that was the time I had to put in, and there was nothing I could do to change it. I wanted to make sure that I did the best job possible, got out with an honorable discharge so I could continue my life afterwards. A lot of these, many of them, I don't think really thought seriously enough about the impact of not having a good record in military service. But no, I liked it. I thought it was a great experience. It helped me mature, gave me a lot of insight into a lot of things, and no regrets whatsoever.
What do you think was the single most important achievement of your military career?
Well, I can't say as I would look upon it as anything particularly significant. I guess one of the things I did when I was on the post exchange is I got their financial situation straightened out. They had a lot of financial problems, and I was able to get to root cause of some of the problems, some of which were personnel, some of which were accounting practices. And when I left, things were in a lot better shape financially. At least I look upon that as an achievement.
What learned skill have you retained?
Cryptography. I still love it. I'm still fascinated by it. I think when the U.S. when the Navy lost the Pueblo to Korea, I was almost ready to cry because I knew the equipment that was there and the complexity and the inventiveness that went into designing it and what was involved. And to think that it had just fallen into enemy hands was just, it was very, very sad indeed. We had incredible equipment that I admired and enjoyed being involved with, and to know that it had been lost was just, it was just tragic. You know, but that's what I came away with a love for the security of how we handle data.
What did you do immediately after your release?
What did I do? I got a job. Now that I was not 1A, I decided now I'm definitely more desirable in the employment market because now I've got an edge that so many others don't, and I went to work. That's what I did.
Where?
In New York City. I went back. I returned to live with my parents and took a job in New York City with a company in the accounting background, in the accounting data processing department.
Did you have any close friends in the service?
As I said, the one that I went to training school with that was from Brooklyn was probably a close friend. My roommate that I went through training school, he was a former enlisted man that decided to, he was one of probably the oldest officer candidate there, was probably in his late 30s at the time. And I got to know him very well, but we never maintained any kind of a relationship after we graduated. I think I may have heard from him once or twice, but I think we pretty much all went our separate ways.
So you're not in contact with any of them?
No, not really.
Did you continue your education?
Well, after I got out of the service, yeah, because then I was eligible for what they call the GI Bill, and that's when I went back to school when I eventually relocated from New York to California. And then I went to continue my education under the GI Bill, and then California, went to Philadelphia, and again went back to graduate school then.
What do you do now?
Now I work as a financial advisor for Merrill Lynch in Hartford, Connecticut.
How long have you been doing that?
Over 25 years.
Did your military experience enhance your civilian life in any way?
Oh, I think it did. It definitely did. The sense of responsibility, appreciation of structure, particularly when you're working for a large company, particularly my company, which tends to be very rigid in many ways. It's a place of employment where if you don't toe the mark, the consequences can be severe, as it was in the military. So I was prepared for that. There are definitely chains of command, both in the military and in a major corporation. So I think it definitely equipped me to handle being a part of that type of an organization.
Is there anything you would like to add to embellish or color your previous statements? Is there something
Well,
that you-
I don't know as I want to embellish it, but I think one of the things that I find a little bit disheartening is that there really isn't as much of a sense of appreciation for people in the military as there were when I was in the service. Boy, in my day, I didn't even have to think about how to get from place A to place B. All I would have to do is go to the on-ramp of any major highway and just stand there, and within minutes, in uniform, immediately you get a ride. There was just a tremendous respect for people in uniform, and not just officers. I mean, actually, officers they didn't want you to do that. But the enlisted men, they would stand on the highway in minutes. They would be picked up. Nobody would ever hesitate. They never gave a second thought as to whether they were some nut, or up. But they always offered a ride, and it was just a different sense of appreciation. And I guess a lot of that is missing today, and it's kind of sad.
In what ways do you see that?
Well, I mean, so many people, seem to have a lack of respect for what's going on with the combat overseas, and they're all trying to, say we shouldn't be there, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. And the military, I think, is just not as highly regarded. I think it's looked at in a different light than when I was growing up. I just don't. I don't think there's the interest in the young people. We don't have a draft anymore. There really isn't this forced recognition of it. It's the kind of thing where they know it's there, but they would just as soon not be a part of it.
Did you sense disrespect when you were in the service?
Not when I was in the service. Oh no, quite the opposite.
Had it begun to deteriorate? Do you
Not yet. No. I think that that came about, I think, once we did away with the draft. Oh my God, when I was in the service, you just walk up to an airline counter without even a question. You were in uniform, 50% off right away. You could travel anywhere, military, it was just, now, I don't think that you get anything like that. No, not that I'm aware of. No.
Thank you very much, Henry. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Nope. I hope it's been useful.